Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I removed and installed the steering rack, the fluid line hose assembly and the power steering pump on my Volvo S40 2007. A short time ago my steering wheel became suddenly hard to turn when I was driving. My first guess was that one fluid line was broken and I lost the hydraulic power. I did not waste any time and the next morning I drove up my car on ramps to have a better look under the car. I placed a small plastic pan under the car to catch the remaining fluid that was still leaking. With a close view near the subframe, it seemed that the leakage was coming from behind the steering rack. That was bad news. I knew that I would probably have to remove the complete steering rack to fix the problem. While I was there, I removed the engine splash shield to clean it before starting the main repair. At least, I had a lot of rags and nitrile gloves for the whole job. To begin, I used the rags to wipe out most of the fluid covering the parts under the car. As you can see, the line hoses near the rack were corroded, but there was no sign of fluid leaks. This confirmed my first observations. The steering rack had to be removed and inspected. While I was there, I removed the 3 bolts holding the transmission bracket. To be able to continue the work, the car was lifted again. I improved the working area and I made it a lot safer to work under the car. I began by removing the wheels to create more space to disconnect the tie rod ends from the steering knuckles. The screws used to hold the inner fender wells were removed with a regular Torx bit socket T20. A 10 mm socket was also used to unscrew the 2 remaining nuts behind each strut assembly. The inner fender wells were still holding in place and I had to maneuver and pull carefully to get them out. When the place was ready, I lubricated the tie rod ends to unscrew them easily. I had no problem to loosen the nuts and disconnect the tie rod ends on both sides. After that, I disconnected the pinion shaft from the steering shaft universal joint. Once the bolt was removed, the steering shaft was moved aside. Before removing any big parts from the car, I unfastened the exhaust rubber mounts located behind the subframe. The second oxygen sensor harness was routed on the rear right side of the subframe near the catalytic converter. It was disconnected to protect it during the rest of the job. Before moving down the subframe, the fluid line bracket had to be disconnected for the inspection to come. For this, I used the Torx bit socket T20. The 2 line hoses inserted in the pinion housing line ports were held in place with a retaining plate and a 10 mm hex bolt. I was surprised by the effort required when I tried to pull out the 2 fluid lines. At the end, I had to wiggle them with pliers to get them out. The fluid ports on the pinion housing were heavily corroded. Because of that, I decided to remove the line hose assembly and refurbish it. I followed the fluid lines and I easily located the 2 retaining bolts beside the crankshaft pulley. Further, on the forward side of the engine, near the air conditioning compressor, one of the 2 bolts was hard to unscrew because the lower radiator hose was too close. After, I used a crowfoot wrench and pliers to disconnect the line hoses from the power steering pump. I did not make any spillage because the power steering pump was mostly empty. The fluid lines were carefully lowered until there was no restriction to put them on the floor. I used a second plastic pan to catch the remaining fluid on the other side. Later, when the working area was cleaned again, I positioned the floor jack to hold the subframe during the following steps. With the place secured, I removed the 21 mm hex bolts holding the rear section of the subframe. Just after, I unscrewed the 13 mm hex bolts holding the subframe bushing brackets. The forward section of the subframe was still held in place with 2 15 mm hex bolts. I had no problem to reach the bolts and they were easily unscrewed. Before removing the retaining bolts completely, I made sure the floor jack was still properly centered. I checked around the subframe for any interference with other components, then I slowly lowered the floor jack. The subframe was moved on, but it was still attached with the sway bar link kit. With more room to work, I unscrewed the two 15mm X bolts holding the steering rack on the subframe. The three small bolts on the steering rack were too rusted to be removed under the car. The safety ramp was moved back to be able to get the steering rack out. The rack had to be moved on the right side of the car in order to be able to remove it from its normal location. After, when the rack was moved on the right side of the subframe, the left side of the tie rod end was free to be moved on the rear side of the link kit. The metal shield had to be removed for the final inspection, but because the bolts were too rusted, two of them broke. Considering that there was a small hole in one of the hydraulic lines on the rack, and also that the pinion housing ports were corroded, I decided to replace the rack assembly with a good used one. I checked online for the steering rack and I decided to get the assembly from Kenny Upul. Once over there, it took me an hour and a half to find and dismantle a steering rack that had no sign of leakage. Back home, I compared the parts side by side to make sure they were the same. Again, with the used rack, another bolt broke. I had to weld a small plate to unscrew the stuck bolt. Because I had an easy access to the tie rod ends and I had the time to prepare them for the wheel alignment, I began by cleaning them on the workbench. The two tie rod ends needed to be heated up to be loosened. When I removed the tie rod ends, I wrote the number of turns on a piece of paper for the wheel alignment. After a good brushing, the threads were cleaned enough to be easy to work with during the wheel alignment. As you can see, the rust is always a big problem up north. After, I continued brushing and cleaning the rusted bolts to ease the installation. I also prepared the red and the blue Loctite required for some bolts. To prevent any particles from entering into the steering rack during the installation, I covered the flow inline ports. The floor was cleaned again and I was ready to begin the installation. I followed the reverse procedure to reinstall the steering rack on the subframe. The tie rod on the right side was moved as far as required. Then, there was enough room to move the left tie rod in place. Once the full assembly was in position, I fastened the two retaining bolts and the torque was set to 59 foot-pounds. I reinstalled the heat shield to protect the steering rack. Just after, the pinion shaft rubber shield was installed while the space was still available. The floor jack was positioned to make sure the subframe was well balanced during the lifting process. I slowly jacked up the subframe and I paid attention to make sure the pinion shaft was properly aligned with the hole in the body. When the subframe was well placed and stabilized, I installed the front subframe mounting bolts. I kept them hand-tight. To obtain a precise alignment when I was installing the front bolts, I used a small pry bar. After, I double-checked the pinion shaft alignment and it was centered correctly. I also checked under the car for any possible problems. Later, I installed the rear subframe mounting bolts. I used a long half-inch ratchet extension bar and I aligned the guide holes together. When the rear subframe bolts were precisely aligned, the two bolts were finally tightened. The torque was set to 207 foot-pounds. Later, when the subframe was secured and the two front subframe bolts were tightened, the torque was set to 89 foot-pounds. I reconnected the pinion shaft with the steering shaft. The torque was set to 18 foot-pounds. Back under the car, the two rubber mounts were hooked on the exhaust brackets and the oxygen sensor assembly was reconnected. The transmission bracket was fastened in place the way it was installed before. While the car was on jack stands, I decided to remove, clean, and reinstall the power steering pump. To do it, I had to remove the front bumper. First, I unclipped the holding tabs on the side and those under the headlights. Once done, the upper fasteners were removed and the bumper shell was easily pulled out. Then, the access to remove the power steering pump was easy. The nuts were unscrewed and the two connectors were disconnected. After, the pump was moved out without any problem. I cleaned the connectors and I checked for any contaminants inside the reservoir. The pump assembly was fine and I put it back in place. I reconnected the two connectors and later I installed the nuts and the fluid lines on the power steering pump. To be safe, I ordered new genuine O-ring seals from the nearest Volvo dealer. The power steering fluid line assembly was in bad shape, but I knew that I was able to refurbish the corroded sections. I carefully removed the corrosion built up on the contact surfaces and I polished the metal to make sure the O-rings would seal properly. The fluid lines that were at risk were also painted to prevent them from rusting too fast. When the line hoses were ready, I installed the new O-rings. I lost no time to install and adjust the fluid line hoses in place. The power steering reservoir was refilled with a CHF202 power steering fluid type. I checked for any fluid leak and there was none. To complete the power steering test, the tie rod ends were reinstalled and I was ready to bleed the power steering. I turned the steering wheel a couple of full turns on each side and I added 2 more slow turns with a 2-second stop on each end. To end the procedure, the steering wheel was put back in middle position. I was satisfied on how the power steering was working and the car was ready for the next step. The front wheels were installed and later I began the toe alignment on them. At first I had big corrections to do, but after 15 minutes, the adjustments were within specifications. The fluid level was checked again, and the car was prepared for the test drive. On the street the steering wheel was precise and the car was easy to drive. For many people, a power steering problem like the one I had makes them consider buying another car. For those who want to keep their car, they see that it could be repaired with hard work and limited budget.